All right. Well, we're done with the first major project on acousmatic sound and creating sounds. So now we're going to move on to music for film, Foley art, and the delicate art of recording footsteps for film and later for video games. So, why do we do this? Why do we record sound effects? Really, it's about enhancing the illusion of reality in the film and replacing sounds that might not otherwise be properly recorded or carried or any of that. We've already looked at how to create interesting sound effects, but now we're going to get real. And we're going to focus on the illusion of reality and really what kind of sounds can we use to really draw audiences into film, and how does that really affect our perceptions? As we move into sound and music for film, this is going to get a little bit more complicated because when you're recording with a video camera, you typically have a couple of lav mics that are on the performers, and you might have an overhead boom mic, and that will pick up some sounds, but it's usually going to be very, very dialogue heavy, and you might only get one or two usable sound effects in any given take. A lot of it is just going to end up on the cutting room floor. And aside from those occasionally well-recorded sound effects from the camera, everything else has to be replaced in post. So Foley art is the art of performing sound effects in time to a film. This is a major topic, and it's not something that I can really do justice to without doing a separate class. We only have a couple of weeks to work on this, so we're going to do as much as we can, but be advised that this is something you could spend years of your life training in and apprenticing in and make a very lucrative career in. There are a couple of standards that we need to discuss and you need to be aware of for when you're working with film clips. In film, the sound has a standard of 48K 24-bit for standard audio quality. For HD, you're going to work at 96K 24-bit, but here's the thing. I recommend you work at 96K 24-bit as long as you have the hard drive space for the really large files that will generate, because you can easily downsample it in post 48K, but you can't upsample easily to 96K. There are a number of formats that you can use in working with film: stereo, surround, Dolby Atmos, THX, any of that stuff. But for this class, we're going to stick with stereo because we're online and because it's really its own separate thing to mix in surround. With frames per second, there are a number of standards. Historically, it's been 24 FPS for film, 30 FPS for TV news and documentaries like the classic National Geographic specials, and 60 FPS for sports. This would allow slowing down things and getting those into the replays. The modern standard is still 24 FPS for film, but now it's becoming more and more common to have things shot at 48 or 60 FPS. This really kind of took off when Peter Jackson did The Hobbit. So the important takeaway is to look at any film clip's properties and set the FPS in your DAW accordingly before you start working on scoring or adding effects. The reason for that is that if you don't, you will have sync and drift issues, and those can really, really mess up a project. But that's enough of standards. Let's go over just briefly the history of Foley. And yes, there really was a guy who started all of this. So the idea of projecting images onto a screen really starts with the magic lantern and being able to shine a candle through a transparent film and project an image up onto a screen. And for a while, that was great, and people were like, oh my god, this is the coolest thing ever. And then they got bored with it, and then we had things like moving images develop, and the silent films. It's important to note that silent films, while they might not have had an audio track, were not necessarily silent. In fact, a lot of theaters had musicians hired specifically to play music for silent films. You would have everything from the grand Wurlitzer theater organs to smaller ensembles like a string quartet or a small wind band that would accompany the film. But in 1923, the technology for sound on film was first developed, and by the 1930s had become the standard. The first major picture to have sound on it was Warner Brothers' The Jazz Singer in 1927. It's important to note that this was only for a couple of scenes of Al Jolson singing. Everything else is a silent film, effectively. But then he starts singing, and people lost their minds, and that was the start of it. At that point, you could do sound and film, and audiences demanded it. But enter Jack Foley. Yes, he was a real person. He was born in New York City in 1891, and in 1914 moved to California. There, he did a lot of different work. He was very famous for being an actor, writer, and director for the local theater. But as this was kind of the dawn of the film industry and everyone was trying to get a piece of the action, he quickly found work in the film industry as a stuntman and body double. And from there, just started picking up more and more work for the studios and coming up with solutions for things that people were trying to do. So fast forward to 1929, Warner Brothers had a huge smash hit with The Jazz Singer, so Universal decided, let's do a full musical, and let's do Showboat. But there were problems. They needed to add sound to reinforce things like the props that were seen on screen, to get the footfalls of the dancers in time and really pick up that sharp crack when their feet hit the stage. But the early mics that they had at the time were only really suitable for dialogue. So what do? They hired Foley and his crew of people who were working in sound, stunts, and miscellaneous other jobs around the lot to figure out how to do it. And what Foley did is frankly genius. He got his crew together on a soundstage. They projected the film on that soundstage and then performed all of the footsteps, all of the sound effects, everything they could do other than the music to the film to ensure that everything was properly synced up. This included all of the hand clapping, crowd murmuring, background talking, and any and all props that they could either get their hands on or make. The result was that you had a film with sound, and it wasn't just, oh, here's someone singing. It was, there's sound throughout. I see someone put down a book on the table, and I hear a satisfying thwack as it hits the table. This is amazing. It's like real life for my ears. So it was a massive, massive success for Universal. And from that point on, Foley started getting more and more work just doing the sound effects, and eventually transitioned to doing that full-time, creating his own studio. And he was very, very generous and paid it forward by training other people to do the exact same thing, how to add sound effects by performing them to a projected film. So the result was that his students would go out and get jobs for other studios, for the same studio, just whoever needed sound effects. And this quickly became the industry standard practice for how you would add sound in post-production to replicate or to enhance the sound effects that you needed to show on screen. Now, the sound used in movie sound effects is heavily influenced by the sounds that you would find in the radio dramas and serials like The Lone Ranger, Little Orphan Annie, The Shadow, any of those classic Golden Age radio dramas. And that relationship would be reciprocated as well. Once a lot of the radio drama producers started seeing what was going on with film and how they were using sound effects, they started adopting the same techniques and sending people to learn from Foley or his students, and then began to adapt the exact same techniques into radio dramas. Fast forward to television, and at that point, it's been standard for years in radio and now in movies. And so when TV came, early TV directors and producers said, we've got to have this. So from the start, it was incorporated into television. One thing that cannot be overstated is the importance of the musical in the development of Foley. Tons and tons of musicals have dance numbers, and those dance numbers may occur while some or all of the characters are singing. So guess what happens? You record a scratch track of the characters singing, and then you record the professional singers doing all of the singing and make it sync up to the characters' lips, and then you insert that over there. Well, guess what? Any dancing sounds you recorded just got wiped out. So what do? Well, in order to get that perfectly synced, a lot of Foley artists would bring in professional dancers and have them perform the choreography on a Foley stage as the film was being projected to make sure that everything was perfectly in sync. Although there is one notable exception to this, that is Gene Kelly, who was perfectly able to do this on his own and would go into the Foley stage and watch himself and perfectly time his movements to get all of the necessary taps. But in the Golden Age musicals in Hollywood, most of the dance Foley was actually performed entirely by women doing both the male and female parts. They would just change their shoes and make them, female tap shoes, male tap shoes, female ballet shoes, male ballet shoes, or female high heels and dress shoes, switch over to male dress shoes, and then they would just dance both parts. That idea of gender swapping for footsteps is still common to this day, but this had the effect of introducing a lot of women to Foley art, and is why there are a lot of master Foley artists to this day who are women. So, let's talk about some of the basic rules of Foley. These are guidelines more than anything else. Trust me, we will definitely have discussions about these in class and arguments of a respectful academic nature, but consider these to be starting points and guidelines. So, in general, 2 tracks of footsteps is traditional, but more can be added if needed. These usually track with the main characters on screen. They are almost always mono unless there is a line or two written in the script that indicates that they would need stereo panning from left to right, or some sort of effect that you cannot do by using the panning on a mono track. There are traditionally 6 tracks of Foley effects. First 5 can be anything and are usually assigned to the actions of characters and general cues required to recreate the sound of the environment that the characters are in, and any other sound effect. And then the last track is traditionally the cloth track. This is used to recreate the motion of cloth rubbing when a character is walking on screen. So it's very, very common to have Foley artists have a pair of jeans or dress pants, khakis, whatever, in hand, and then they will actually perform cloth cues like that, perfectly in sync with the footsteps, so that you get that cloth rubbing sound as well. Again, all of these tracks are almost always going to be mono unless a stereo panning effect is in the script. Why do we want to work with mono? Because we're going to have to place these as individual sound sources in relation to where objects appear in the film. And it's much harder to do that with stereo. You will see it for things like flybys and passbys, but generally everything's going to be mono. And again, more tracks can be added if you need them, but 6 tracks is kind of the tradition. Here's the big one. This is a performance. You are performing the effects, which means you have to commit to the performance. There is no way to do this half-heartedly. It does not matter what you look like. It only matters what it sounds like. Yes, you will feel self-conscious about it. Yes, I felt self-conscious the first time I did it. But keep in mind, it doesn't matter if you look like an idiot or think that you do. No one is going to see you recording these. They only hear the results. Another major consideration is that you're enhancing the film narrative, but you don't necessarily need to do a one-to-one recreation of the sounds. There are a lot of sounds that occur in everyday life that are going to be left out. What you need to do is to focus on what sounds are most important to the film in the scene and what will need to be enhanced in order to give it that sense of realism. So this is kind of the best advice, is to see with your ears. Focus on what the sound is that's most important. Watch the film without any sound on. Just completely turn it off and create a cue sheet based on that and figure out, okay, this is what's going to be important. This also involves listening with your eyes. This is called spotting the film, making the cue sheet of the most important sounds based on what you see that need to be there to serve the narrative of the film. For recording and leveling, again, almost all Foley effects will be mono unless the script specifies a stereo panning effect. Again, mono, mono, mono. However, for environmental ambience, if you're going out and recording the sound of a cafe or the sound in a forest, that will probably be stereo, or occasionally it will be recorded as ambisonic and then converted to whatever format is needed. In general, you will always want to record more than you need so that you can pick the best one when working with environments. So if you need 5 minutes of environmental ambience in a cafe, record 10 minutes. You can always cut, splice, layer, any of that. Footsteps and sound effects should be performed to the track. This will ensure a proper sync and that you're not futzing with the nudge feature in the DAW too much. It is okay if you are one frame behind where the sound effect would occur. Like if you see that something comes down and hits a table and you're just one frame after that, that is fine because light, sight, vision, all of that occurs faster than we hear. Don't worry too much about that, but you will want to strive to make sure that everything is in sync. When recording, using a very focused mic is essential. Shotgun is your weapon of choice, but shotgun mics are a little specialized and kind of expensive, and depending on where you're working, a small diaphragm condenser will also work. Dynamics can be used, but only inside for very, very close miking of sounds or voices. In general, condensers are better than dynamics, and shotgun condensers are the best for a lot of Foley cues. Always monitor your recordings through headphones. If you're doing this on a portable recorder, make sure your headphones are plugged in. If you're doing it directly into your computer via your DAW, make sure you're listening to it so that you can hear exactly what's happening. And then balance is the key here. The dialogue is the star of the film. That is what's carrying the narrative action. It's not the music, it's not the Foley. Dialogue has to be up top. After that, there is some wiggle room for what's more important to the scene, the sound effects or the music. But the dialogue has to sit on top of everything. So let's talk about ambience and footsteps and creating a sense of place in the film. So for ambience, you need to record environmental sounds that are appropriate for the location. You know, where are you in terms of the scene? Are you in a forest? Are you in a desert? Are you in a cave, in a city? What do those environments sound like? What do you really hear there? In a forest, you might hear pine needles rustling as trees move. You might hear birds. You might hear some insects. You're probably not going to hear wolves howling or bears unless they're a specific thing in the script. In the desert, you're probably going to hear a little bit more sound of sand lightly moving. You might hear some wind, probably not a whole lot. Cave, you're going to hear a lot of reverb. You might hear water dripping. That's about it. Cities, you're going to have people talking. You're going to have cars passing by, in which case that will probably be stereo. You're going to hear all sorts of noises from traffic, bicycles, sirens, general random music, and other noises. So what are you hearing? And then are the sounds moving? And if so, how? And how do you have to record those? What sounds contribute to the location and make that location? If at all possible, record the real thing in the real location with a portable recorder. It may be necessary if you're recording crowds or people to hide the mics or portable recorders, though. They do make a lot of people ask what you're doing and who are you and why are you recording me? I didn't give you permission for that. So there are ways around that. Obviously, you can get some nice little lapel mics that will just plug into the back of your Zoom and wear those on your backpack straps and keep everything else in your backpack. But it might be better to also bring your friends in and record crowd noises, as we discussed earlier. You will also want to use windscreens outdoors at all times to avoid wind noise. Wind noise is the easiest way to destroy the ambience of a location. And again, always monitor your recordings through headphones. If you feel that your recording is too thin, remember that you can always layer it using offsets. So record 5 minutes, take that into your DAW, create a couple of copies, start one at 0, start one at 10 seconds in, start one at 20 seconds in, one at 30 seconds in, wait for them all to get in, and then find a loop point and use that. Again, for crowds, just to refresh you from a couple weeks ago, you can always record yourself and a bunch of friends talking nonsense syllables around a mic to get the contour of the speech needed in the scene. And remember, go for how they would be talking if they were an angry mob, a crowd at a bar, if they were a military battle or monsters growling. And they can just say nonsense syllables. They can say, vegetable lists. Or you can give them various drug names and have them try and recite those. Anything in Latin, anything like that. You can also reverse it at low volume levels to really add more depth to this, and that will give you a pretty good basic walla track. Alternatively, you can use multiple recordings. Different languages, reverse some in a foreign language will create a really nice murmuring if it's at a lower level. You can use forwards and backward versions in layers, automate some volume changes between them. Just remember to keep the overall volume level down. And of course, reverb and offsetting will work wonders. Footsteps are potentially the most important part in the Foley track. So you need to consider, what are your characters walking on? Is it concrete? Is it tile? Is it metal? Is it dirt? Is it rock? Is it gravel? What type of shoes are they wearing, and what do those shoes sound like on that surface? And the important aspect of having cloth tracks, so you get that swish of material while their legs are moving. It's very hard to overstate how noticeable that is when it's not there. Again, you can add the cloth track in the Foley mix traditionally if you were recording your footsteps somewhere because they have a specific material or sonic characteristic, then you can always add the cloth part in post. Again, these are typically mono and 1 track per major character with a generalized cloth track. Footsteps can be stereo if it's indicated in the script that a panning effect is used, but otherwise it is mono. The best way to do that is to set up a stationary mic and record yourself walking to the major character motions on screen, but you do need to commit to this 100%. Some considerations. Don't forget that you need to keep the ambience, footsteps, cloth, and Foley below the dialogue level. I cannot stress this enough. Yes, there will be some sound effects that will be louder, explosions, gunshots, anything like that, but in general, keep it below the dialogue level. It needs to sound real, but the dialogue still needs to take precedence. If you absolutely cannot record a specific ambience, footstep, or other thing, check online. freesound.org, BBC Sound Library. They have tons of things, especially crowd sounds on the BBC library. And for stuff like that, don't be afraid if they're in a different language. Create a layer, reverse, and reduce the volume. It will sound just like a crowd murmuring. Also, use a really directional condenser mic for everything except for the voices. Shotgun if you have it. If you have a supercardioid, that's pretty good. If you don't, use a cardioid. Don't use an Omni, except for occasionally working with really low frequency sounds. If you're using a portable recorder that is not going to give you the ability to do mono, make sure that before you start working with whatever you're recording, take it into your DAW and bounce that track down into mono first. This is a big one, and I cannot stress it enough. Name your files with descriptive names. So, footsteps, male, concrete, .wave. If it's a stereo, add a stereo tag. So, footsteps, male, concrete, left to right walk, stereo, .wave. Then, store things in named folders on your sample hard drive. Create a folder for ambience, for footsteps, for household items, etc. Subfolders as needed. Also, be very, very conscientious of how you're tagging things. It will make your life so much easier when later on you have to find a specific sound and you can just navigate through your folders. And then finally, it's better to record more than you need. You never know when it will be useful later on.